Hey folks, my name is Mo Amir and this is VANCOLOUR, British Columbia's bona fide culture and politics TV talk show. Tonight we're cutting through the noise to reach a clearer understanding of BC's past and the challenges we face today without losing sight of the hope that we can build for our shared future. If you're unfamiliar with tonight's themes, we'll walk you through why these conversations about Indigenous title and residential schools still matter in 2025. From the 1880s to 1996, more than 150,000 Indigenous children were forcibly taken from their families and placed in residential schools, government-funded institutions designed to suppress Indigenous cultures and languages while forcing children into unpaid labor and subjecting the children to overcrowding, disease, neglect, and abuse. Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission documented more than 4,100 children who died in these schools. Many children were buried on school grounds, often in unmarked graves. The real number of deaths is likely higher due to poor record keeping. In 2021, the Kamloops First Nation used ground-penetrating radar to identify possible burial sites of 215 children at the Kamloops Residential School, corroborating long-held oral histories. Still, some skeptics, including a few BC MLAs, argue that because quote-unquote zero bodies have been confirmed at the Kamloops site, Canadians are being misled to support a so-called quote-unquote reconciliation industry. To separate facts from fear, a graduate of the Peter A. Allard School of Law at UBC, host of the Nuanced podcast, and since July, chief of the Chawathil First Nation, Chief Aaron Peet. Aaron, what an honor. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so let's just start at the beginning here. What was discovered at the Kamloops Residential School site in 2021?
Originally, the claim was that it was 215 child burials were claimed. And then about a month later, it was 210 ground-penetrating radar found anomalies that could be child remains. So that's, I think, the first piece to understand is Sarah Boulot had clarified it was not 215, it was actually 210 anomalies, and it is anomalies from ground-penetrating radar.
And what does this mean for Indigenous communities? I mean, this whole discovery.
It reconfirms what a lot of First Nation communities know and have experienced, which is that children went to these schools and died. And due to a lot of different factors, a lot of children did not come home or are not able to be located. And so for First Nation communities and many First Nation leaders, I think there's a groundswell of deep understanding. First, these are people's lived experiences. They have lost family members, or they have been to these schools. So they know the conditions that they were put through. It would be likened to you trying to tell somebody about World War II who actually went and fought there, right? Like being able to read a book about it is very different than their lived experience of what that was.
So it's quite validating in that sense.
Exactly, that they know that this really did happen, and it confirms things they've been trying to tell government for a very long time. And the gap, as you just described, is we do not have the bones, we do not have those pieces, and so people are coming forward and questioning that, and whether or not they should be looking in this specific location. And so we know that there were graveyards within these schools and within these areas. That's not disputed. It's the specific location that I think is getting a lot of questions and feedback because it was funded to look into.
How much of this is the media's fault? Because those initial reports, once this discovery was made, explicitly said things like mass graves, or even said things like the remains of children were found. How much of it was the media, or how much of it was maybe some miswording in the initial discovery?
Certainly the media has a lot of accountability to take. In speaking with a lot of different journalists, what I've heard from them is this was something nobody wanted to touch. Nobody wanted to question this. Nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of this story. So a lot of journalists reparroted the original CBC story because they didn't want to look like they were questioning or challenging or being dismissive of those lived experiences. And I have a lot of respect and understanding for how people come to those understandings and want to be sympathetic. I think it's worth just tying in that we ask for truth and reconciliation. And so we do need to vet these claims. We do need to have an understanding. And the fact that the media wasn't able to do that led to prominent voices rising, because there was a gap that was left by people not doing due diligence, by the story having minor changes to them. And that's resulted in, I think, where we are today.
And I don't want to defend the media by any means, but I feel like perhaps because of the historical marginalization of Indigenous voices or Indigenous lived experience, that's maybe why the media leaned in that direction in terms of, reporting it as remains found as opposed to anomalies in the ground. Right?
Correct. And I would say that you're building off of a solid understanding. The Truth and Reconciliation comes out in 2015. It gives very clear information as to the fact that there are many lost children, over 3,200, that we know that there were more, that the reports weren't properly done, as you described in your introduction. And so there are these pieces here. Then we have the oral testimony that says, this is really what happened. These are our lived experiences. And so it's not based on nothing that journalists were giving deference to that idea. But I think it's important that we come to the table willing to have really challenging conversations on this to bring down the temperature in the room.
I feel like there's some people in the public that want, CSI style excavations of exhuming these bodies. Why is that realistic or not realistic?
It's a very complicated conversation. It's my understanding, and I could be corrected, that Williams Lake has chosen not to excavate. But what communities were giving funding for was to look into this, to do ground penetrating radar, to have meetings with their elders and community about how they wanted to proceed, to have some really difficult conversations on that front, and potentially to excavate. But that was one line item in a lot of these applications. And so that may end up being one of the challenges. The other piece is just the sacred ceremony. I don't think many people would feel comfortable me going into graveyards and digging around for their lost relatives. And so I think that's where a lot of the weight of this comes from, and a lot of the discomfort, because you see these posts of 0 bodies found. Well, how comfortable are we in digging up that aspect of it? And communities are deciding that for themselves and having conversations with their community members. And I understand the desire to kind of put a close to this and to move forward based on the fact. And I think that's the challenge that we're in. We have people who want to know definitively, and we have communities that are like, I know, I don't need to dig in order to know. And that's the gap.
But what do you say to someone who goes, well, a lot of these communities, not just in the Kamloops site, but across the country, have been given millions of dollars of funding to explore what happened here. So where is that money being spent? I mean, that seems to be a very common question with quote unquote denialists, or just people who maybe want accountability from the government.
And those are the pieces. So obviously all of these communities have to report on what they did with the funding, and that goes back to the federal government. So that's the first piece. The second piece is it could be going towards, I can't verify, my community isn't participating in this, but it could be going towards meetings with elders, meetings with community members, doing the ground penetrating radar. That would have been funded through that grant. And so that's what that funding goes towards. One of the line items would be excavation, but that would be in consultation with the community. And so there's lots of other pieces that grant funds. It's not necessarily just excavating.
We have about a minute left here, but when you see someone like Dallas Brody, the leader of the One BC party, she is a sitting MLA in the BC legislature, and she's holding up a sign that says 0 bodies, and that's outside of Penticton, in front of a sign that's supposed to be commemorating these children that were lost at that school or never made it back home. What goes through your mind as an Indigenous leader and someone who's very involved in these topics?
This is going to be unpopular, but my perspective, I try to be nuanced about it. So on the one hand, I can see that journalists didn't dig into this story to the extent that perhaps Miss Brody would have preferred. And the other piece that I would say is she brought something up, a question that I think has merit to it that makes people very uncomfortable. And I think that those individuals are right to be uncomfortable with how she's raising it and how she's choosing to approach it. And so I have a lot of sympathy for her approach, and I think she's going about it in the wrong way. But I'm trying to make sure that I don't get lost in being displeased with how she's approached it and try and take the merits of the argument forward.
When you say go about it the wrong way, do you mean tone? Like she's taking the wrong
tone, the signs, that approach, I think is very polarizing to many people. And I am trying to bring the temperature down in the room as much as I can to make sure that we can all move forward with a British Columbia and a Canada that we can be proud of. And I think that approach really distances so many people from being able to participate in the conversation. And I don't think it's the best path forward.
Well, that's why you're on the show, because I know that you give a balanced approach. We have to take a really quick break. break, but once we're back, let's talk about the Cowichan ruling that everyone in the province is talking about.
Looking forward.
Welcome back to This is VANCOLOUR. In 2015, the Cowichan Tribes, along with several allied First Nations, filed an Aboriginal title claim over a stretch of land on the south arm of the Fraser River in Richmond, arguing it was a historic village and fishing site used long before colonization and that it was never ceded or surrendered. In August of this year, 2025, the BC Supreme Court agreed. This is a big deal because it's the first time in Canada that a court has recognized Aboriginal title over land that includes modern private property, not just Crown land. The title area includes roughly 140 parcels of land in total, a mix of public, industrial, commercial, and a small number of privately owned homes, likely only a few dozen at most. Nonetheless, the court decision has raised a lot of anxiety. Does this ruling mean that private property owners in the area suddenly lose their properties and in some cases homes to be handed back to the Cowichan Tribes? Could this happen to you in another part of the province? To explain, we're back with the chief of the Chawathil First Nation and host of the Nuanced podcast, Aaron Pete. So, Aaron, as someone who is a law school graduate, someone who obviously looks at this, I know you've done a long-form essay on this as well. What is the significance of the Cowichan decision by the BC Supreme Court?
As you mentioned, the Tishel Colton case in 2014 was the first decision of this type of nature where we were looking at Aboriginal title to land in British Columbia being claimed, but this is the first time it's happening in an urban setting. So we have the precedent already set back in 2014, but this really changes the conversation and brings all British Columbians to the table in terms of the impacts that the decision could have.
Okay, so let's talk about those impacts, because what would you say to someone who lives in Richmond or perhaps just anywhere in the province who goes, this decision means that I actually don't own my home anymore?
So that's not what it found. It did find that Aboriginal title is senior to the Land Title Act and that system and the Torrens system, but it does not mean that anybody is losing their homes. It does mean that the province has a duty to consult and the feds have a duty to consult and meet with the Cowichan community and start to work out exactly what does reconciliation look like in this regard. But I do think that the Cowichan tribe has been very clear that they are not coming for eviction notices, that is not the approach that they're taking, and that's not even on the table. And I think that story's really gotten away from a lot of different governments, and we need to bring it back down to reality on what's really going on.
I guess it's one thing for the First Nation to say, yeah, we're not after your private property, but if they have legal claim to it, that's a whole nother issue, right? So what assurances do you have that, people, as far as you know, people will not be losing their private property homes that they have title to?
I guess I would say that we go through these claims fairly regularly as First Nation communities. We have specific claims processes and negotiations with the federal and provincial government on lands that we claim were never ceded and that we'd like to seek to resolve. And none of that results in eviction notices for anybody. But I do think that this speaks to the fact that we need to move away from a model of going through the court system. And we really need to start to bring to the table the province, British Columbians, Canadians, and First Nation communities to start to develop a plan. How are we going to resolve these long-standing issues? How can we create certainty in the market? How can we create certainty for homeowners and certainty for First Nations that unceded land, the land they never gave away, is able to be resolved?
Is this something that we can place the blame squarely on BC Premier David Eby, or is this an issue that precedes him being Premier, him even being Attorney General?
I'm going to go really fast. So I would say that for the NDP, my perspective is they were moving forward with a lot of reconciliation agreements and they were negotiating the Haida title agreement. They have been negotiating with different First Nation communities. There have been several treaties signed over these past few years that are really hallmarks and steps towards resolving some of the confusion around all of this. So I do think the NDP is on the right track in that regard, but I think their mistake is twofold. One, I don't think they brought British Columbians into that conversation. And so I think a lot of British Columbians are for the first time starting to think about Aboriginal title and exactly how that impacts them. And I think had we brought them in 2015, we may be having a different, more relaxed conversation. Two, I think their decision not to incorporate people into this specific decision and thought that it wasn't going to have the impacts it did was a mistake from the outset. Reconciliation is about all British Columbians, Canadians, anybody who's interested in being at the table, being invited to do so. Us just doing government to government and leaving out everyday citizens who might want to be involved in that conversation, I think was an error. And I think that other opposition parties are starting to escalate the polarization in terms of these conversations, and homeowners are scared, and I have sympathy for their situation.
You really speed ran through all of that. But I guess reeling it back a little bit, what it sounds like is the court basically signaling that the provincial government, regardless of who's in charge, has to negotiate with First Nations when it comes to these land title issues. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, but it doesn't have any impact, so far as we can see, towards the everyday operation of people being able to buy and sell their homes.
Right. Okay.
So our community is in negotiations with the federal government. It has no, and we're claiming certain lands. It has no impact on the people living on that land today. It's a negotiation that may be resolved through cash settlement, through negotiated getting crown lands in other areas. There's lots of different ways to resolve this.
So when the BC government says that it's going to appeal this decision in court, is that the wrong approach? Should they be actually, creating a negotiating table where they create an actual deal with the Cowichan Tribes?
I think they were blindsided by the outcomes of this decision, and I think that's their fault. Like, I think you need to take responsibility when you're not prepared for the impacts of a decision. You should have been, and it sounds like they were consulted by the courts in that regard. Hearing from Premier David Eby, and I think on Global News, saying we had a different understanding. I think that's still on them, but I do think appealing it gives a little bit of certainty for at least British Columbians that this is not going to proceed as is. So I think it staves off a broader conversation, but now it's time to have the conversation. Now we need to start talking about how do we resolve these settlement claims? How do we start to look at Aboriginal title? And how do we give clarity for all British Columbians? And I think that does need to be everybody come to the table and have a conversation about what the path forward is. I would say historically that's been treaty, and that gives a lot of people a lot of certainty around what that looks like. The Nisga'a Treaty did not raise the same concerns and reaction as this case is bringing.
Right.
And so I think there's different paths forward, and we have to start looking at those, and we do need to bring in British Columbians. It's not fair that they are watching these agreements happen. That's what I hear a lot of commentary on, is we see all of this going on and we're not getting our voice at the table. And I think that's where a lot of this political wildfire is coming from, is people are feeling left out and fearful of what decisions their government's making and how they can voice their concerns or their opinions.
Interesting. Now, really quickly, I am seeing a lot of commentators say that, this is the result of land acknowledgements, that because of our culture of, acknowledging the ancestral lands of different First Nations, of course, issues of title would arise. Is there any truth to that? Do land acknowledgements have any legal bearings in terms of what the Supreme Court rules?
No, they don't. But I do think that it changes the political atmosphere, right? So historically, we've seen courts very resistant to the idea of making decisions on Aboriginal title. From First Nations lens, we've had to push them towards making some of these decisions. I think the political atmosphere for a decision like Cowichan Tribes was considered more popular probably over the past 5 years, because everybody was thinking about okay, what does that mean and how do we resolve this and what does that look like? And now the decisions come down, and I think people are like, well, that's not really what I signed up for. And I think that's, again, where we've left a certain group of people, British Columbians, out of the conversation, and they need to help inform this so that we have a reconciliation that everybody can be proud of. Awesome.
Okay. We have to take one more break, but when we come back, I want a little hope. I want a little positivity to end us off here.
I got you.
Welcome back to This is VANCOLOUR. We're back with the chief of the Chawathil First Nation and host of the Nuanced podcast, Aaron Peet. Aaron, it feels like BC is behind the other provinces when it comes to treaties with Indigenous peoples. Is that a fair assessment?
It's a unique situation. So from my understanding, when Canada was coming across all of the provinces to sign treaties, they found that it was a slow and arduous process, and they wanted to get more things done quicker. So very basically, the governor at the time had decided, we're going to set up anticipatory reserves. We are going to move towards that type of process, and we will stave off the treaty process because that will take too long. Then his follow-up was Joseph Trutch, and he took over and downsized those reserves sometimes up to 90%, and that's what we've been sitting with ever since. And so communities like Nishka, like Chawathil, and others have started to sign these really historic treaties, but we are in a very different circumstance, which is why BC is often the leader in terms of changes. Like we have First Nations Health Authority, a provincial health authority for First Nations people. That's unique than any other province because we've developed so differently than others from the East. It also means that we have vagueness in regards to our Aboriginal title and ceding the land. Those treaties resolved some of those disputes, and we have not done that here in British Columbia.
Interesting. Now, public opinion on reconciliation seems to be changing a little bit, especially after the Cowichan decision. Give us some hope in terms of what you see in the future for Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples working together in an environment of true reconciliation.
It's an important point. I believe, and I could be mistaken, but I believe that when we have good economic times, like in 2015, when we had a balanced budget and a surplus of like $1 billion, we're able to have complex conversations on the environment, on social issues, and on Indigenous issues. When the economy is not good, we're not able to have those complicated conversations, and we go back to what's in my fridge, can I afford rent, those types of important conversations. That doesn't mean one's worse or better. It means that we're in a different time and we have to adapt. And so I do see people wanting to focus more on those issues, and the uncertainty with the Cowichan decision and other conversations are kind of creating more uncertainty rather than less. And I think that's a frustration for many British Columbians and Canadians. And so my hope would be, I see so many different First Nations leaders really understanding this and wanting to come to the table and work with their counterparts in municipalities, in the province, and want to bring everybody together so that we can be a united Canada or a united British Columbia to proceed in a way where everybody is able to reach their full potential, have food in their fridge, and have a home. And I think all of us wanting that brings us all together if we can start to focus on those core pieces of where do we want to go as a province or as a country, and how do we make sure everybody's given that opportunity.
Wow, incredibly said. I can't top that. Aaron, thank you so much for your time tonight. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a privilege.
Folks, that's our show. A huge thank you to our guest, Chief of the Chawathil First Nation, Aaron Peat. Check out his podcast, Nuanced with Aaron Peat, on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. It's insightful, it's informative, and yeah, it is genuinely brave. If you have thoughts on tonight's show, I want to hear from you. Please email me, mo@thisisvancolour.com. Also, please follow me on all the socials @VANCOLOUR. Big gratitude to Pacific Sands Beach Resort in Tofino for supporting local conversations like this one. We're back next week, but until then, stay colorful, friends. Peace.